Michael, thanks for talking to us. Could you tell us a bit about the history of the Glad Day Bookshop?
Yeah, of course. So Glad Day was founded in sort of its first incarnation in 1970, so we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary next year, which we're all really excited about. We're taking the opportunity to sort of to really push our nonprofit arm, which I can talk a bit about. But yeah, it was founded by a man named Gerald Moltenhauer, who then eventually, in sort of its first little while, it existed in various forms. At times, it was sort of like out of his apartment or out of his backpack or out of like a shed in his backyard. Eventually, he sort of started renting spaces in the city, and so it eventually ended up at sort of the space that it was at the longest, which was over. You can actually still see the sign over at Yonge and Wellesley, which is sort of just like a 5-minute walk north of here if you wanted to go take a look. It was a second floor storefront space with a third floor. At first it was an apartment and then eventually became an event space as well. So Glad Day has sort of existed in various forms and evolved a lot over the years. And Glad Day also at one point had a Boston location as well, which eventually burned down, which is why they stopped doing it there in Boston. And so Gerald eventually sold the business to a man named John Size, who owned it, I think, at the Yonge and Wellesley space for basically decades. About I think 7 or 8 years ago, John Size was looking to retire. He wanted to either close or sell the business, to live the rest of his life. And at that point, a group of people led by our sort of lead owner, whose name is Michael Erickson. He sort of gathered a group of people together because it's like Glad Day is an institution. It's been around for decades. They didn't want it to just disappear as so many independent bookstores in the city did. And so they sort of pooled together some money and bought the business, and have been sort of running it as sort of a group of owners, not quite a collective, but it is like a group of people who make the decisions with Michael acting as the lead owner. His line is that they've been losing money ever since, which is definitely the case because it's an independent business in the city. It's impossible to turn a profit, but. So that was about 6 or 7 years ago that they finalized the purchase of the business, and that also there was also some political changes that went with that as well. A much bigger focus on sort of more diverse practices. Glad Day, I think it's fair to say, historically was like a very gay male centric business. With obviously like lots of literature for lesbians, a little bit for trans people and people of color as well, but under the new ownership, Glad Day has like really broadened the sort of diverse angle with a really strong mandate of like anti-racism, anti-sexism, like pro-trans, pro-people of color. Pro-Indigenous as well, which is also a huge thing. And so about 2 years ago, I guess it would be almost 3 years ago now, they had realized that the business had sort of plateaued in terms of like the money they could make. They weren't losing money, but like there was really no room for the business to grow. A huge issue as well with the space over at Yonge and Wellesley was that it wasn't an accessible space, because it was up a flight of stairs just to get to the store, and then it was up another flight of stairs to get to the event space. And so they made the decision at the time. At the time, the business that is in this location at 499 Church Street, Byzantium, which was a bar, restaurant, and club, they were looking to sell the business, and so it was definitely a move to create a more multifunctional and accessible space. Accessibility was a huge reason for the move.
Was it the first LGBTIQ bookstore in Canada?
So you'd have to do some fact finding. I want to say yes. It's certainly the oldest and the oldest surviving. There's also there's Venus Envy in Halifax, and then Little Sisters in Vancouver. I hope I got those two right. I always get them mixed up, but I'm pretty sure. And neither of those, both of those are very pro-LGBT businesses. I'm not sure if they consider themselves like, because Glad Day has always been an independent business that's like queer owned and queer run for queer people specifically. So like I don't know. Yeah, you'd have to look into that, but. I mean, like we're now that we have sort of, now that we're coming up on our 50th anniversary, we're the oldest surviving LGBTQ bookstore in the world. Like others have come before, but we're the only bookstore that's still open and still operating. So.
And how do you decide what types of books to sell?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We were actually just talking about it. And so, especially, so I've been working here for about almost 2 years now. I just sort of started as the bookstore manager about like 6-ish months ago. It's been sort of like an evolving role. And so I've been really focusing on tracking stock, and I've been really focused on new releases, new titles. Historically, Glad Day's had a focus on, I think, the backlist of books that have been around for a while. Whereas I was just finding, just from my like anecdotal day-to-day evidence, that like it's new titles that move really, really quickly. And especially I find, like again, I've been tracking, and it's backed up by our sales evidence. The sort of sections that do the best here that we just can't keep stocked are, and they're sort of broad categories, but we sort of have our trans and non-binary narrative section. So books that focus on like trans-identified people, non-binary people. We have our Indigenous and Two-Spirit section, which like we can't keep it stocked. Like it's just, there's such an appetite for those narratives, which is incredible, and I think really says something both about sort of like the zeitgeist, but then also like the audience that comes into Glad Day as well. And then sort of like the broad category of people of color, sort of narratives and authors. That's another section that is just incredible. And then the last one is history and theory, which I think makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of overlap between those sort of four broad categories. Like there's certainly plenty of people of color authors in the history and theory section, and vice versa. But yeah, those are sort of backing up based on like what sales have been like over the past couple of years. Those have been sort of like our priority sections, both like economically and then also politically. Like those are obviously sections that we end our customer base also, I think, skews very, very heavily towards like it's one of the very few spaces in sort of the historically gay village that like I think people of color feel very safe and welcome in, and that certainly is the case with a lot of like our staff is very, very diverse in that sense as well. Certainly with trans-identified people. So yeah, I think it's it all sort of influences every other, like our customer base certainly influences the books that we keep and the kinds of events that we have. So it all sort of influences one another. So
what kind of customers do you get?
So I would say our like demographically our customers skew younger. Definitely I would say like 20s, 30s. But then we certainly have a lot of elders who come in as well. I think they skews very heavily towards like non-binary people, people of color. Again, there's very few spaces that specifically cater to those like sections of the queer community, and especially in like the gay village. So yeah, I would say that those are sort of like those are kind of like the like our target audiences, especially politically, like because those are the kinds of people that we want to like support and celebrate in our space.
What are the biggest challenges of running a bookshop?
Money, like economically, certainly, because I'm trying to like collect my thoughts, because it's sort of like what I'm obsessed with every single day of my life. Certainly, just getting books on the shelf. I think a lot of people have become used to sort of like the Amazon sort of like concept of shopping, where like you snap your fingers and you have a product in your hand. Whereas for every single book that we have on the shelves, it typically means that like that 60% of that book's cost is like money that we have paid just to have that book in store, and so that's like a very small profit margin for us. So like I think, and then just also like the rent here is criminal. Like it's like it would be, I just can't imagine why anybody would want to run an independent business, despite the fact that I found myself in a management position within one. So,
how did you become manager? How did you get into your role?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I started here a couple of years ago. As just a sort of like bookstore associate. I'm a writer as well. I have a book on our shelves. And so that's how I'd sort of become involved in Glad Day, was as both like a writer and then just as a community member, like volunteering with them. But I've also worked too many retail and service positions in my life. So I started here a couple of years ago just as like a bookstore associate. Eventually, the manager who had come on, who had come on around the same time as me, she left, and so I had already been taken on a lot of responsibilities just in terms of like accounts and like stock and tracking and stuff. So it just all sort of continuously growed the kind of roles I was doing. I was sort of resisting being a manager because I was working part-time at the time, so that meant I could take a lot more time to sort of myself and like writing and things like that.
What's your favorite genre?
Sci-fi fantasy. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so then eventually I just sort of accepted the position that I was a manager. So,
and also I believe the bookshop over the years has had a lot of social involvement, such as donating books to universities.
Yeah. And just also, I think it's one thing we don't acknowledge enough, that a lot of the groups that come into Glad Day, a lot of the times we don't charge any rental fees or anything like that, because we want to make ourselves very accessible to the community as like a community hub, a place where people can gather. And so a lot of the times we certainly don't ask money of people. So that's like, I don't think we sort of realize how important that is in the community, because very much so. And it's something that a lot of groups, like, it's really interesting that like I think a lot of groups use the space for those purposes, but because all of the groups are so disparate, there's not sort of, we often say that we might be like a bookstore, bar, club, and restaurant, but then we're also like an unpaid community space as well, right? So
do you have book launches here?
Yeah, well, tons. Yeah, lots, as often as we can. So yeah, lots of different kinds of book launches.
And also, I believe the bookshop's been involved with something called the Naked Heart Festival.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, so Naked Heart is part of our nonprofit arm. So there's sort of like for-profit side of Glad Day, which is the like physical business, the space, the books, the bar cafe. Naked Heart is part of our nonprofit arm, which includes different kinds of social programming, but Naked Heart itself is actually the world's biggest, specifically queer and trans literary festival. So it's been, I think we're going into, I want to say our sixth year now, I think it's our sixth year. Which is coming up in November. So it happens every November. We have like usually over 70 queer and trans identified authors, with over like 120 different kinds of like panels, readings, book launches, like art and culture events. So Naked Heart is like, it's a really incredible experience. It's like, it's just been growing as the years have gone on. So we have it's like a multi-space event. So we do events here. We do events at Buddies and Bad Times Theater, which is like Canada's queer theater. And then we also usually rent an event space up the street as well. Very much important that we sort of like keep it within the community, and that it's all queer and trans authors, with a very strong mandate of like Indigenous and people of color authors as well. So I think that the actual rule for Naked Heart is that it has to be at least 50% women and 50% people of color authors, which is like, you don't get that with any other book festival that I know of.
A couple more questions.
Yeah.
Glad Day, that's a William Blake reference.
Yes, yeah. It's the Dance of Albion, I think, is the William Blake painting. So the original Glad Day logo, it sort of changed since then, but it was actually the Dance of Albion. It was an outline of the Dance of Albion, so the man sort of standing within the rainbow doing his little dance. So yeah. It's we've had cards of it floating around over the years, but I don't think a lot of that is sort of lost on people who have gotten involved with Glad Day more recently. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary, and a lot of the staff are talking about getting sort of like tattoos, because like Glad Day is a very meaningful job for a lot of us, right? And so we're talking about getting sort of like group tattoos.
Awesome.
And so a couple of us, I sort of came up with the design of the William Blake Dance of Albion, just the original logo outline, with then in the new logo, which is like a book with a sort of like rainbow motif coming out of it. So to sort of melt those two, it's like the William Blake logo and then the rainbow motif coming out of the top to sort of merge the old Glad Day with the new. So yeah, it's exciting to be around at such a sort of like a pivotal moment and a historical moment for Glad Day.
What are your hopes for the future for the bookshop?
So I've been working really hard at trying to grow sales, and I've certainly seen some success. It's always a struggle. We're an independent business. We're always struggling financially. But certainly for me, just to sort of focus on different strategies of growing the bookstore business. I think just making it even more than it already is, a sort of like a queer flagship, like a queer. It's becoming increasingly like a queer destination. People literally come from out of town and they say like, I knew that I was going to come to Glad Day like before I left, right? So, so becoming more of that sort of thing. I think we just want to see the business survive and hopefully thrive. So we're all just like working really hard. We're all doing way too much work for way too little pay, just to sort of see the business survive and thrive. So,
what's the most popular types of books?
Yeah, so like I can certainly think in terms of individual titles over the past little while, and like again, going back to the sort of sections that I was talking about, I can just sort of pick out some like really popular titles. So Johnny Appleseed by an Indigenous Two-Spirit author named Joshua Whitehead. Their book Johnny Appleseed it's one of those books that we can't keep on the shelf. In terms of like especially people of color authors, Vivek Shreya, who is like a prolific author, a queer Southeast Asian trans woman who her most recent title is I'm Afraid of Men, but she has like dozens of other titles, and so like she's another really, really popular one. I'm trying to think in terms of some other sections. So we have a 2017 title called Any Other Way: How Toronto Got Queer, and it's a bunch of sort of mini essays about Toronto's queer history, and that one we just like I think it's sort of like the best book you can put in somebody's hands who wants to learn about Toronto's queer history.
How much Canadian content do you have?
I try to like if I can help it, I try to do a majority of I'm a huge CanLit person. I'm a CanLit author, so I want to see CanLit more and more on the world stage, and so I'm very much in support of really celebrating like CanLit authors. And there are, especially in terms of like queer and trans people, there are just some of the most incredible authors in the world, and it's amazing to be able to celebrate them.
And finally, if people want to find out more about the bookshop, is there a website?
Yeah, so we have a website, has a lot about our history. We're really, really active on social media, so especially like our Facebook pages. We keep very, very up to date with like our events, which we're constantly doing so many things here. And especially with Naked Heart coming up, that's super important as well. Naked Heart also has its own Facebook page, and then our Twitter account is also super great, which is just at GD Books. So
what's the website?
GladDayBookshop.com. Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you.